All right. Thanks for joining in on this, anyone who's joining and watching. This is going to be a part of a series we're going to do on pagan and Platonist, specifically apologetics. So this all really started with a debate that we saw from a Telegram channel called Pagan Revivalism. And they did a sort of paganism versus Platonism debate. And, gave us a really good opportunity to talk about Platonic apologetics. How do we actually defend our ideas and defend what we believe against some of the attacks that are out there? There's a certain contingent of people out there that are extremely anti-Platonic, and we want to be able to have a good defense for some of those things. The guy who was in the debate goes by S and actually ended up joining our Discord after, which is awesome. And he does a really good job later in the debate. And what I'm going to do is just offer a couple bits of commentary on it, things that I think could be addressed in here really well as far as how to apologetically respond to some of these things. And I'm going to do this in parts. So it's a pretty long debate. It's like 2 hours long. So I'm going to start off with the opening statements, and I'm going to focus really on the guy who's calling himself, quote, pagan. And I say air quotes pagan there, not to say that he's not a pagan, but he's the one making this distinction that Platonists aren't pagans. And so I guess he's the quote pagan guy in this debate. But I don't want to play into his idea that Platonists aren't pagans. I think that's a silly sort of distinction that he makes that doesn't really make any sense. And that honestly might be where we start this. It's framed up as being this debate between paganism and Platonism. That's the debate. So S does a good job of calling it out at the beginning that, it's a silly kind of framing tactic to say that Platonists are not pagans. Now, me personally, I'm not very attached to the word pagan. I don't think it's a great word to describe who we are anyways. But if we're getting down to brass tacks about what that term means and where it came from, then it really doesn't make any sense to say that Platonists aren't pagans. It comes from the Latin word paganus, which means villager. And it really gained popularity under Augustine when he wrote The City of God. Tertullian used it before too, but I think Augustine is really where we start seeing it being the most popularized and where it gets its kind of common definition. And so a lot of people don't know, but The City of God, written by Augustine, the full title of it is The City of God Against the Pagans. So you can see that there's sort of a play that he's making with the words there. He's saying the city of God with the city dwellers, the urban dwellers, they're Christian and they're cosmopolitan, and they have all of the enlightened views of the court in Rome. And these filthy villagers, these pagans out in the rural areas, well, they're still attached to their old fuddy-duddy religion. And, the same kind of thing happens today when people talk about, Bible-thumping rednecks. That's the context of the term. And for that reason, I don't really care about the term anyways. I mean, if these guys really want the term pagan, they can have it. But it's clearly he's already pre-framing this argument to his favor to try to say, oh, well, you're not even pagan. So he's already kind of come to the conclusion that Platonists are not pagans, and then just put that into the title of the debate, which frankly I think is dishonest. But regardless, let's jump into the opening statement that he gives, and I'll give some commentary as we go along, because there's a lot of things that he says in there that just aren't quite true, and he goes on for like over 10 minutes, so I can't really blame S for not being able to jump in and respond to every little thing along the way. So we're not going to listen to it in all one run. We're going to kind of take it bit by bit, and then the later parts of the debate will probably break into separate videos so we can kind of address core issues more specifically, but we'll at least touch on them high level here.
So what is Platonic philosophy? Well, it's built upon a couple of pre-existing thoughts that were going around the Greek world at that time. One of which was the Pythagorean cult. And we know this because Aristotle himself, in his Metaphysics, Book 1, Part 6, wrote that he was a devout Heraclitean, and that he followed Orpheus and the Orphic cults, and that he followed Pythagoras. So, what's up with the Pythagorean cult? Well, they didn't partake in sacrifices. And we'll get back to this because this is probably the primary difference between Platonism and paganism is how one is supposed to do it.
Okay, so right off the bat, this just isn't true. The Pythagoreans did participate in sacrifices, they just didn't participate in blood sacrifices. The same goes for the Orphics. And this goes with their beliefs about reincarnation and the transmigration of souls. If you believe that souls are transmigrating and reincarnating, and they believe that they could reincarnate into animals, well, then it doesn't really make sense to eat animals. Causing that kind of suffering to them would be unethical. So they didn't do it. But they still sacrificed to the gods, and they would go to altars like the altar of Apollo and offer bloodless sacrifices, which the sacrifices to Apollo were bloodless sacrifices. So it worked fine for them. So saying that they didn't sacrifice or saying that they weren't doing it within this sort of bounds of traditional religion is just a lie. That's not the case.
But they didn't, the Pythagoreans didn't partake in sacrifices. They used secret passwords, secret handshakes, private clubs. They were vegetarian, but they didn't eat.
I just think that's funny. Like, they didn't do sacrifices, they did secret handshakes. It's like, oh, they did sacrifices. And, the first golden verse from Pythagoras is first honor the immortal gods. So, I mean, it's not like they were atheists or something like that, or against sacrificing to the gods. They just didn't do blood sacrifices. They didn't sacrifice animals.
Beans. And the reason why they didn't eat beans was because when you fart, you release evil spirits into the air. Now, that that seems funny, but this is their beliefs.
Well, it seems funny because it's absurd and it's not true. So we don't know exactly why the Pythagoreans had a rule to abstain from beans. There's a lot of different theories about it, but we don't actually know the exact reason why the Pythagoreans abstained from beans. Some people even think it was a sort of hidden symbol to avoid voting because people used to vote with beans. So abstaining from beans would mean abstaining from voting. Other people say that it's not even all beans, it's fava beans in particular, something to do with their shape. And the more general theory on this is that they believe that somehow the soul could transmigrate into beans. Maybe it's just because they're like a protein-like substance or something like that to believe that they're like a sort of plant flesh type of thing. Who knows? I mean, the fact of the matter is we don't know why they had this abstaining from beans belief. And it's kind of a silly thing to bring up. It gets brought up a lot, maybe because it is kind of a strange belief and people don't quite understand it. But the later Platonists didn't really understand it either. And it's not like abstaining from beans became a big part of Platonism later on. And, if we could sit down and talk to Pythagoras about why he believed what he believed about it, maybe we'd get some clarity on it. But we don't have that available to us. And in a broader sense, too, he's pointing out that the Platonists did draw from people like Heraclitus, the Pythagoreans, the Orphics. He's going to get into this a little bit more, but this is ultimately a good thing. Platonism is always absorbing other traditions and the best parts of them. That happens later on as well with Stoicism, where Platonism starts to absorb in the best parts of Stoicism, even taking in the teachings of Epictetus, who undoubtedly would have had some things that would have been, non-Platonic beliefs, I'm sure, but the Platonists were able to look at it and go, you know what, this is great regardless, and we're going to take all of the good parts of this and incorporate it into our ideas as well.
Pythagoras, as well as Plato, were devout Heracliteans. Heracliteans wrote against religion and sacrifice. One of the snippets that we have from Heraclitus says, they wash themselves of their blood with blood. They're crazy. Like washing themselves with mud after they stepped in mud. And they talk to statues like they would have a conversation with a house. If this sounds like atheistic style thinking, you're not wrong.
He is wrong. about this. No, it doesn't sound like atheistic thinking to me at all. It sounds like they're thinking about what the gods really are. And they're saying the gods are not these statues. The gods are being represented by statues, but Heraclitus did famously sort of mock people for talking to the statues as though the statues were the gods themselves. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that. If people do want to sort of have a conversation with the statue, if that helps them sort of commune with the gods, who cares, And I don't think Plato really had a problem with it either. That was one of Heraclitus's personal views that didn't really transfer over into much else. But also saying this, you're going to purify yourself with blood. You're going to wash blood with blood. Again, this is a criticism of blood sacrifice. This isn't a criticism of sacrifice in general. It's a criticism of blood sacrifices, and which was a major part of Orphism and Pythagoreanism. And yet, just the same, you do see Socrates and Plato endorsing sacrifice throughout their works. One of the last things that Socrates says before he's put to death is to go sacrifice a cock to, I forget what temple it was. But he says, yeah, go sacrifice this chicken for me. Okay, so he's obviously not against it. And the later on, the Platonists do follow this trend though of endorsing more bloodless sacrifices, but it was never even unanimous. Iamblichus famously defended blood sacrifices and the value that they had. People like Porphyry disagreed with it, but there's a vast amount of different thoughts about it within the Platonic tradition, which is ultimately, I think, a good thing. This kind of diversity of ideas. People have to stake their case for why they believe something in Platonism and make a good reasoned argument for it, not just blindly believing this idea or that idea.
Because Platonism, as what would later become after the death of Plato, the academy that he founded adopted skepticism. And academic skepticism, which, by the way, each and every one of you can look up, was started in the Platonic Academy shortly after Plato's death. Orpheus.
I think he's conflating skepticism, the ancient school, with like modern skepticism, like Skeptic magazine, like that kind of idea, like atheistic skepticism. And those things are not the same at all. Academic skepticism that happened after the academy was turned over from the original sort of Plato and Aristotle was different. And really their idea was kind of taking Socrates' idea of aporia, or not knowing something. A lot of the dialogues from Socrates end in this sort of state of not knowing the answer to something. If you read them, you might find them a little dissatisfying at times if you're expecting the dialogues are going to be this treatise of exactly how to think about something. That's how Aristotle writes, right? Aristotle will sit down and tell you, I'm going to tell you everything about ethics and how ethics works and how to understand virtue and vice and create kind of a system for you. Socrates and Plato don't really do that. They're asking questions and they're encouraging people to think for themselves. And a lot of times you end this dialogue, like the Euthyphro dialogue, which he's going to bring up, but it kind of ends as like, well, I guess we're never really going to get an answer to this question. And that's the end of the dialogue. And it's supposed to leave you in this state of what they call aporia, where you're sort of thinking about the topic, but you don't necessarily have a perfect answer to it. And that lack of knowing, at least knowing that you don't know the answer to the problem, will lead you to actual philosophy, will lead you to do proper philosophy, which is thinking about these things, contemplating them deeply. That's the goal. And so skepticism kind of took that idea and made that a central idea of theirs, where they were very hesitant to make strong doctrinal or dogmatic statements about things. And this ends when we get into the Middle Platonists a few hundred years later, and then the Middle Platonists really start to systematize these things. And the Stoics, for example, were highly critical of the skeptics. They're like, because essentially what the skeptics are saying is you can't really know anything for sure. Where it's very, very hesitant to say anything. They're kind of like agnostic, really, about most things. And they were rightly criticized for it. It was It was a bad period in the academy that it fell so quickly into this kind of useless philosophy that never really produced anything of value because they were afraid to say anything at all. And the Stoics did a great job criticizing them, and then Middle Platonism and Stoicism kind of came together against that kind of skeptic philosophy, and then that ends up birthing Neoplatonism later on as people start investigating into these things more and systematizing Plato. So it's a weird criticism that he's bringing up. It's a well-known part of Platonic history, but it's not something to be embarrassed about or anything.
Also influenced Plato. The biggest one is the myth of air, which is at the end of the Republic, where Orpheus and the Orphic cult developed an anti-life theology and philosophy.
He's going to say this a lot, this whole anti-life philosophy of Orpheus. And I think I'll address it in a separate video because there's just too much to say about it here, but it's not an anti-life philosophy.
Why? Because, well, we have to look at the story of Orpheus. Orpheus and Eurydice were about to get married. Eurydice died from a snake bite, and Orpheus was so moved he went into Hades, convinced to cross the river Styx, went to the throne of Hades and Persephone, and said all of these beautiful songs for his wife back. And Hades and Persephone said, "You got it. You can have your wife back, but under one condition." That condition? To not look upon your wife until you leave the underworld. Do you think he followed directions? No. What he did was he turned around. Eurydice was sucked back into Hades. And then this distraught Orpheus. And I'm going to read you a quote here from Ovid, his Metamorphosis, Book 10. Quote, "3 times the sun had entered the year in watery Pisces, and Orpheus had abstained from the love of women, either because things ended badly for him or because he was sworn to do so. Yet many felt a desire to be joined with the poet, and many grieved at rejection. Indeed, he was the first of the Thracian people to transfer his love to young boys, to enjoy their brief springtime and early flowering this side of manhood. In other words, the gay Greek stuff is the Orphic stuff. And we know, as a matter of fact, that Orphic cults had a profound impact on Plato. Famously, he never got married, never had children, and hated women. He wanted equal rights for...
Okay, I'm going to stop him right there. So I got my Ovid here, my Metamorphoses, my Metamorphosis. And yeah, he's absolutely right about this line in here. So this is in, for anybody that wants to look it up for themselves, it's in Book 10, between lines 52 and 85. He does say his love was given to young boys only, and he told the Thracians that was the better way. Enjoy that springtime, take the first flowers. Okay, so this might sound like some sort of damning thing, like, oh, the gay stuff in Greece, it all came from Orpheus. Okay, well, what's the source? Why is it that Ovid is saying this? Why is Ovid saying this about Orpheus? Well, the source of it for him is another author, an ancient author called Phanocles. And Phanocles wrote a book called Lovers of Boys. Okay, so this was written during the Hellenistic period, by the way. So Orpheus lived, over 1000 BC, somewhere like that. Is around the time frame when he was living. And the Hellenistic era is like 3rd century BC or later. So somewhere between 3rd century and year 0. His Hellenistic period. And that's when Phanocles writes this Lovers of Boys. And in it, he talks about a bunch of gay relationships that he believes people were having in the myths. One of these is what he talks about with Orpheus. And he even has one between Dionysus and Attis, I believe, or Adonis. And then he has another one about Agamemnon, that Agamemnon was actually gay too. So, if they're going to use this argument and you want to say that this is that this is a good source of information, well, then you have to admit Agamemnon's gay too. And you have to admit that Dionysus is gay too, and that this one author, Phanocles, actually knew what he was talking about. When all of the people who research this don't believe it at all. They just think of it as a later interpolation. That even in Ovid was trying to sneak this kind of stuff in, really as kind of probably digging on the Orphics and just trying to put them down and bolster sort of Roman machismo and that kind of mentality. And this is actually from, let me see, Charles Paul Sagal, who is a classical philologist at Harvard and was kind of the foremost authority on Ovid for a long time. But he mentions that, and I'll quote him here, lastly, in books 10 and 11, Orpheus's shift to homosexuality and misogynist hatred after the death of Eurydice becomes the reason for his death by dismemberment at the hands of the Maenads. By rejecting heterosexual loves and turning into a demasculinized male, the effete rhapsode becomes the prey of the followers of Bacchus, who slaughter him like a deer in the middle of the theater. So the whole theme that Ovid's playing with here is trying to explain the death of Orpheus and saying, like, basically Orpheus ends up getting torn apart by the Bacchants because he's gay. And that's his idea. And all of this is based on one poem from a guy named Phanocles, who wrote a bunch of these about ancient characters being gay, which is widely regarded as being completely made up. And having no other reference in the entire history of Orphism that he was gay or had gay lovers after Eurydice. Literally zero. There's no other evidence of it except for this one author in the Hellenistic era. So this would really be like if, nowadays a lot of people will make the case about Achilles and Patroclus being gay lovers. And if we had some scholar today who wrote a whole book about how Achilles and Patroclus are really gay, and then 1,000 years from now somebody looks back at all of it and goes, see, this author from the American Empire wrote about how they're gay, and so yeah, that must be the case, they're gay. So that's the source of the gay stuff, was Achilles. It's a silly argument, and I understand most people probably aren't aware of the reference that he's making and where it comes from, but it's just totally bogus.
Women, but like all male feminists, he really disliked them.
I find this funny too, and just have to mark that. So Plato is a male feminist who wants equal rights for women, but also hates them. Got it.
How do we know this? Well, one of the things is his last words, which were deciphered in a scroll that was preserved in Vesuvius, in Pompeii, where it says, his last interaction was with a Thracian slave girl who was playing a flute to him to kind of ease his suffering. And he criticized her for being slightly out of tune. This is the mark of an asshole.
I don't know, I think it's pretty funny, to be honest. First time I heard that story, I thought it was hilarious that to the very end, Plato's a perfectionist. He's one of those people who is very particular, and I just think that shows a lot about his personality. I don't necessarily think it means that he's some, I don't know, and women-hating asshole. If that's the point he's trying to make here, it doesn't really make sense.
Not the mark of a serious figure.
Plato's a serious figure. I don't know how you could deny that or take some anecdote of what he said on his deathbed and say, oh, well, we can't take this guy seriously. He was mean to a Thracian girl's lyre playing once. That right there is an unserious position.
Now, I do have some other notes, such as in Euthyphro, where Socrates, through Plato, of course, Socrates never wrote anything himself, and these private conversations and dialogues Plato wouldn't know the intricacies of, but let's take it for granted. In Euthyphro, Socrates, who is the puppet to the ventriloquist of Plato, says, do you seriously believe that the gods do this and do that? And Euthyphro says, yes, they do, and many more great things. Again, we have this dilemma of skepticism, of saying that the myths can't be real. In fact, in the Republic, it says we cannot allow people to know that the underworld is real and terrible.
So there's a whole bit on the Euthyphro that he goes into later. So I think we'll make a separate video just on the Euthyphro dilemma, because it's actually a great dialogue and it really does line out some important things of how we understand the gods and how we know what we know about them. But I'll let him finish and then comment.
We have to rewrite it. This is in Book 3 of Plato's Republic, which, by the way, you can listen to it yourself. It's free on YouTube on audiobook. That the gods are moved by prayers was repulsive to Plato. Sacrifices was seen as a type of bribery or rank commerce, which real gods don't do. Why? Well, because Plato says so.
Okay, so because Plato says so, we're going to address the comments in the Republic later, because again, I think we'll make a separate video just on the stuff with the Republic, because it's such a big part of his argument here later on. But let's just take this part about sacrifices. Why that getting into sacrificing to the gods as far as like an exchange between them, as though like we're going to sacrifice things and that is going to influence the gods. And he says, well, why is that not the case? Well, just because Plato says so. Well, that's not at all the reason. He gives a very good reason for why, if we sacrifice to the gods, that it's not something that affects them, because the gods are not affected by the things that we do. The gods are perfect. They're unchanging. And if they are, that doesn't make sense that if we're going to sacrifice to them, like I'm going to give you a pile of meat and put it on a pyre to burn, that's going to really affect the gods at all. That they're going to take it in and go, oh, that's such yummy meat. I'm going to do good things for you. That puts the gods at a completely different level than the way that Plato understands them. That puts gods at the level of beings, and it also puts them at the level of beings that require sustenance from humans, that somehow require things from humans and can be changed and motivated by humans. So it's taking the gods from where they are and putting them on a much lower ontological status. And, the thing that you could really relate these to would be what we call daimons. Daimons could be potentially influenced by the material world and by material sacrifices, but the immortal gods in the intellect, in the nous, would not be affected by those things. And so that's why he thinks it's below the gods to do it. And it's very, very clear throughout the whole of Platonism that that's the mentality, is that the gods are not affected by our sacrifices. And the reason why we pray and the reason why we sacrifice is not to try to enact some change within the gods, but to enact a change within ourselves so that we become more like the gods. That's the reason we do it. All of this is very clearly laid out, so I don't know why he would say that it's because Plato said so.
Evil doesn't exist in Platonism. This is one of the big gripes. Because in Platonism, all is one. And the one is good. And everything participates in the one. So if everything is an emanation of the one, all is good. Well, what about certain instances? Like that one instance in Germany or Austria, I forget, memory kind of does that sometimes, where you tend to forget minor details. But there was a case in Germany or Austria of a woman who was trapped in a basement for 24 years and was raped and sodomized over and over and over again for 24 years. This was a horrific case in Europe. And what does Plato say about those evil actions? Well, those evil actions must be good. Why? Because we just don't appreciate the goodness. All is good. Therefore, there can be no such thing as evil. But the Platonist...
Okay, let's get into this one. So there's a lot that can be said about the problem of evil in Platonism, and his whole argument against it is just a giant straw man. And he repeats it again and again and again, but it's not a very good argument. So we're going to tackle some of it. I think it's worthy of its own a whole video to itself. So we'll probably do another one of just talking about the problem of evil alone when he later on they get into a deeper discussion about it. But let's just touch on it real quickly here for these opening remarks. Basically, he doesn't understand how Platonism operates as far as what the good means and what the one means, and how it all comes together. He continually is framing Platonism as though it is monism. And Platonism is not actually monism. That's sort of a mischaracterization of it. It includes some monistic ideas, but is not monism. And so Platonists are not saying that all things are identical with the good and that all actions are good. We're very, very aware of evil. And so I'm going to pull up something, and this is something I'll probably pull up again when we're looking at this in a little bit more detail. But I want to pull it up for now and offer a little bit of a commentary to this. So I got my Plato over here, so I can take a look at him directly. And let's talk about evil and as far as how they understand evil. So this guy's saying, well, if everything's the one and the one is the good, then all things are good and then there can be nothing bad. Well, it's an absurd position to take, and no Platonists actually take it. No Platonists are denying that there is evil. Proclus wrote an entire book called On the Existence of Evils to try to help understand evil and how it relates to the good. I do agree that it's a problem if you don't have this sort of dualistic conception that like a Christian does, that there's fallen angels like the devil that are sort of producing evil in the universe. That can be a little bit, it's a more difficult thing to explain, but it's not that it can't be explained at all. So I'm going to read this little bit from Theaetetus for you guys. And this is, if you want to look it up, it's Theaetetus 176a. And they're having this conversation about evil and about the world. So Theodorus says, Socrates, if your words convinced everyone as they do me, there would be more peace and less evil on earth. And Socrates says, but it is not possible, Theodorus, that evil should be destroyed, for there must always be something opposed to the good. Nor is it possible that it should have its seat in heaven, but it must inevitably haunt human life and prowl about this earth. That is why man should make all haste to escape from earth to heaven, and escape means becoming as like God as possible. Okay. And he even explains one more. I'll finish this line. He says, and a man becomes like God when he becomes just and pious with wisdom. Okay. So what does Plato say there on this topic? Is this all things are good and we just don't see the good when someone's being raped or some other horrible thing is happening, and that's just it. We just didn't see how good it was, and we just didn't have the right understanding. No, that's not what we see at all. We have Socrates saying right here that nope, evil is a part of reality, and you can't get rid of it. There has to be something opposed to the good. And this is ultimately why Platonism is not monistic, because we're not saying that all things are good. There is non-being. So we'll get into this a little bit later too in more detail. But when we talk about the good and the form of the good, we're really talking about being itself, right? And a lot of the comparisons that we make between goodness and evil in Platonism go with these kind of analogies between lightness and dark, right? So light is the good, darkness is the absence of light. We'll hear this, I think he mentions this in just a minute. But darkness does exist, right? We're not saying darkness doesn't exist. That's the kind of argument he's trying to say, is that Platonists don't believe darkness exists. It's like, no, we believe darkness exists. We just don't think it has being. We're saying there's no form of darkness, just the same way as there's no form of evil. And so when we want to talk about a bad situation like somebody getting raped or some horrible thing, that's a deficiency of the good. Absolutely. And that deficiency, as Plato says, has to exist. There has to exist something opposed to the good. That is non-being. And this is why we're not monistic in the sense that all things are good, because the one isn't just the good. We call it the good, but frankly, all of our names for the one are terrible. We shouldn't call it the one. We shouldn't really call it the good either, because the one, let's just call it the ineffable for now. The ineffable transcends both being and non-being, right? It's not being itself, it's not non-being. It transcends both being and non-being. It's beyond both of them. And so what it means for something to transcend it is that it contains both of those within it. It can contain being and non-being together. And that's exactly what Plato's saying here, right? Is when he says, Theodorus, that evil should, that it's not possible that evil should be destroyed, for there must always be something opposed to the good. Okay? There must always be something opposed to the good. So this whole argument that he has that all it is good is directly refuted right here. So if anybody ever tells you this, all you have to do is pull up Theaetetus 176a, read it to them, and that should be the end of the argument.
Has a cope for this, because this was a big problem. A lot of people made fun of him, including Diogenes, homeless dude, playwrights. So what they came up with was evil is just the absence of the good, right? Like darkness is the absence of light. The problem with that is if everything is an emanation of the one, that means the one is everywhere and cannot be absent of places or things, meaning that these evil actions are either A, good, or B, they're not of the one, meaning that all is not one. Welcome to polytheism.
Okay. So this is going to be a recurrent theme throughout this, so we'll probably address it a few times. But this guy really doesn't understand what transcendence means. And it becomes a recurrent problem throughout the entire debate that he can't really wrap his head around transcendence. When he talks about the one, in his mind, you can tell the way that he talks about it, he thinks of the one as being all things as one. And all things as one is not the same thing as the one. Okay? Let me tell you the exact difference. So all things as one would better be described as being itself, because it's all of the things all at once everywhere. Like if you just imagined in your head, you're thinking your house, then you think the world, then you think the universe, and every possible conceivable thing you can cram in there, including emotions and souls and objects and thoughts and all of that. Cram it all together, all of those things as one. That's what he's thinking the one is. And that is not what the one is. The one transcends all of those things because it is beyond being. They get into this topic a little bit more specifically later, so we'll probably have to address it again. But it's a fundamental misunderstanding that he keeps making, because he's saying, oh, well, if all of these things are that, then how can it not be that all things are good? Well, it can be because there is both being and non-being, and the one transcends both of those. So, and what it means when something transcends something is that it is imminently available to all of those things at once. Okay? So let me give you an example. I'll give you an analogy to make this a little bit more clear. The relationship between these things is the relationship between colors and color itself. Okay? So if I said there's cyan, magenta, and yellow, right? There's these three kind of colors that you can make pretty much every other color with. Okay, you have these three colors. And what is the relationship of those three colors to color itself, right? Color itself is not any one of those colors. And yet it is simultaneously all of those colors at once. It's color itself, right? It's the property of color. And if you were to say something like, if you have something that's red or not red, right? Maybe that's not going to work in my analogy here. Hold on. But let's relate it. Let's just go ahead and relate it back to what I'm talking about here with being and non-being. So if we have being and non-being together and something transcends it, it then becomes available to it the same way that color is itself is available to all colors. But color itself is not any one of the colors in existence. And even if I were to take something like a color wheel that had all of the different gradients of all of the different colors on a wheel and showed it to you, is that what I'm showing to you, color itself? No. I'm just showing you all the colors that there are. I'm showing you a representation of all of the colors that there are. That's the relationship of what he's talking about here. He's confusing all of the colors all together in a color wheel with the concept, the form of color itself, which actually transcends any particular color or even all colors as one. It's color itself. It transcends it. It doesn't have any one of the shapes of the things within it. And so in this case, when we're talking about evil, he's mistaking kind of being itself for the one, really. And that's a fundamental mistake that he makes multiple times throughout here that needs to be corrected. And I don't know if he would ever grasp it. I think us did a pretty good job of trying to explain that to him, but I'm not sure if it got fully through to him. But this is that problem. He's not quite grasping transcendence. And then he's also conflating all things with the good as though all things are only good, and that there isn't this issue of non-being, which, like I said, is touched on here in Theaetetus, and it's also touched on in the Timaeus. In the Timaeus, Plato brings up the idea of the chora, the space in which everything happens, and that is really the space of sort of non-being where all of this stuff happens. So what we have is this gradient from pure being all the way to non-being, and all of these different gradients in between. So we really don't have a problem explaining evil, and we don't have a problem explaining how that happens. It is deficiency, it is darkness, but at no point are we saying that darkness doesn't exist and the whole universe is just light. And at no point are we saying that that evil doesn't exist and it's all just good. Nobody's ever been saying that at all. And we have to explain it. It's a little more complicated than just, I think, some of the more simplistic interpretations that he ends up taking, but it's perfectly coherent.
Right. And we have abolition of the family and private property, as William Bradford points out. He's one of the founding fathers of the United States. And his treatise of Plymouth Plantation wrote that the people who founded Plymouth used the Platonic model of sharing everything in common, and they almost all starved to death. What cured it? Getting away from Platonism, that all things are to be held in common.
So we're going to address some of this more in the Republic commentary because this is a big part of the Republic. But I just wanted to make a quick point on the abolition of the family. So he mentions this a ton, and this is going to be a part of that bigger Republic commentary. But I'm going to read you something from Plato. This is one of the last works that he ever wrote, and I just want you to ruminate on this. So this is in Laws, and this is Laws 931d. And he says, "So as we said just now, we must reckon that the most precious object of worship a man can have is his father or grandfather, weak with age, and his mother in similar condition, because when he honors and respects them, God is delighted." Does that sound like anti-family to you? Does that sound like abolishing the family? I'll have more in the Republic commentary, but that's just a little taste of just how silly this opinion is.
What about abolition of the family? We know that abolition of what was Plato trying to do? He was trying to eliminate nepotism. But he was also trying to eliminate those pesky family traditions. He wanted to get to the kids while they were young so that he can reprogram them through noble lies, as he points out in Republic Book 3.
I mean, the line that you can draw between reprogramming people and educating people, I mean, anybody who wants to have a society has to educate the young. I mean, you can call it reprogramming, but even if this guy were to make his perfect folkish society, I guarantee you he would be programming the young to not be Platonists and programming them against those kinds of ideas. This is a very normal thing to try to tell the young what is good and what is bad and educate them as best as possible. So it's just a silly framing tactic.
Platonism quickly turned into academic skepticism after his death, and some broke away, thinking that atheism was just a step too far. These became what's known as the Middle Platonists, who later fused with Judeo-Christianity to form Gnosticism.
Yeah, I got no idea where he's getting this, that the Middle Platonists, fused with these people and made Gnosticism. I mean, maybe the Gnostics were inspired by Middle Platonic ideas, but that's not the same thing as fusing together to make Gnosticism or something like that.
Which Neoplatonism would fight against. Seems like Platonists argue with Platonists quite often.
Yeah. Platonists do have disagreements with other Platonists, and really that shouldn't be anything out of the ordinary. We're a logical tradition that believes in argumentation and reason. And, just the same thing if you look at other natural traditions like Hinduism, for example. Are there a lot of different Hindu philosophies and sects? Yeah. There's Dvaita, there's Advaita Vedanta, there's Vishishta Advaita. There's a bunch of different versions of the religion and philosophies that go along with it. That's not odd. It'd be much stranger if there were absolutely no disagreements between people. That's odd. The way that you get no disagreements between people is Christianity. You kill all the people who disagree with you, or you burn them alive. That's how you get no disagreements.
They don't even know their own theology, even though they all follow Plato.
Well, it requires an exegesis of the texts. And that's really no different. I mean, these guys are taking myth as the one and only. They're mythical literalists and they're mythical fundamentalists, where they think that basically myths are divine revelations, the same way that the Bible is a divine revelation, which frankly is a Protestant perspective. I don't even think it's a pagan perspective at all. We could call these people Protestant pagans more than anything because of that belief. But everybody's going to base it on something. And I think basing our religion on rationality and theology is a much better way than basing it on ancient poems. And those ancient poems have value, but to treat them as infallible truths is just silly. And Plato makes a great case for why that is.
Platonism worked with Jews and Christians to destroy traditional pagan religion.
No, they didn't. This is another kind of conflation he's making. Christians adopted some Platonic ideas, and then Christians destroyed the ancient world. Platonists didn't do that. It was the Christians under Justinian that shut down the Platonic Academy. Does that sound like them working together?
We know this because Christian Trinitarian theology is entirely built upon Platonism, 3 gods being 1 God.
Yeah, they copied our stuff.
Islam, Judaism, and Christianity love Plato. This is why they preserved it. The Nag Hammadi Library, the oldest Christian library, has the complete works of Plato, including the most complete Book 6 of Plato's Republic ever found. Not only this, but Jewish Kabbalah is built off of Neoplatonic ideas.
So yeah, of course people read Plato. Plato was one of the most popular authors in the ancient world. Everybody read Plato. It's just part of being educated in the ancient world was reading Plato and Aristotle. And they're great works. So yeah, of course other religions have picked them up and said, wow, there's a lot of really good stuff in here. We can rework this for our own purposes. Yeah, of course. If the ideas are true, then that's exactly what you would expect. Is that anybody from any religion picks it up and goes, man, this makes perfect sense. And that's why you'll find this stuff all over the place. It's more of a testament to its truth than anything else. And the claim about Kabbalah's got some Platonic ideas in it, frankly, but it's also very heavily Jewish. And, I've looked into it because a lot of the Renaissance philosophers were really into Kabbalah, but, I don't see there being a ton of use in it just because it is so heavily Judaized. And I don't think you can really pull Kabbalah out of its context within Judaism and turn it into something that would be useful as a Gentile. But did they pull some Neoplatonic ideas and really more so Hermetic ideas? Yeah, absolutely. But so what?
And in Islam, which is vehemently anti-pagan, way more so than Christianity ever was, or Judaism for that matter, Islam created Sufism, which is Islamic Neoplatonism. Now, I'm going to ask you just a hypothetical. You don't have to answer just now, but why would, if Plato was pagan and represented pagan theology, why would Islam adopt it?
because Plato had great ideas about God and theology that can be applied to most religions because it's true.
It should raise question marks in your head.
No, it really shouldn't.
These are purported to be, beside the Jewish Bible, to be the two pillars of Western civilization, as though traditional religion and Bronze Age civilizations never existed.
Well, maybe people don't see a huge difference between Plato and the ancient religion. And there might be some differences between them, but I think the important part is that Christianity is what excluded ancient religion. And Platonism existed alongside all of the ancient practices of the ancient world and integrated with them for over 1,000 years, and they weren't in some sort of fight against each other. Really, what you're pointing out is the absurdity of this idea of paganism versus Platonism. It's a false dichotomy.
And Plato wanted to censor everything. This is where I'll end it on. Where debates such as these would be banned by Plato. And
if Plato wanted to do that, he did a pretty terrible job, because the next 1,000 years is people arguing and debating about these ideas and writing commentaries on all of these different ideas. And the academy wasn't a place where people got banned for having different ideas. In fact, I think part of the problem with the later academy is they were maybe too accepting and too tolerant of other people's ideas. They ended up, allowing Christians in, and I think that ended up causing more problems than it solved. But no, they were non-exclusivist in their beliefs. So
debates all over the place, all over the internet, and society in general today are being censored, thrown out. This had its basis in Platonism, especially in the Republic.
To say that modern censorship on social media platforms is based on the Republic is absolutely absurd, and it's just not even really worth responding to. It's a really stupid thing to say.
But also in other dialogues, where they say that if it goes against the ideology, it must be censored. And that's what we experience today. In fact, this was also pioneered by Soviet philosophy. Believe it or not, if you look this up, Platonism, Marxism, in the Soviet Union, you will find that Plato was taught as the forefront, the basis, the bedrock of Soviet philosophy and economics. So,
yeah, I don't think Marx was a Platonist, if that's what you're trying to say. And again, I think this is just more kind of ridiculous conflation, just trying to associate Platonism with all of these things that are obviously bad. I mean, it's, the same thing could happen on the flip side. I could just say, oh, well, all of this Germanic imagery was used by Hitler. And, so that means that all German pagans, they're really just, esoteric Nazis. It's that same kind of nonsense. So it's a really lame argument.
This real debate comes from a debate between the foundations of the modern world that we see around us and the basis for the world as it once was. If paganism is to be rebuilt, it must do so without Platonism. There have been many Platonic revivals, not one of them in the past led to pagan revival. And that should tell you everything you need to know as far as their intentions. Their intentions are not to bring back traditional religion. It is to bring back the reverence of Plato above all things and his one God, the good.
Yeah, one of the problems these guys have is they have this sort of vision of like traditional religion as though it's this monolithic thing that we all have like a really perfect grasp of. And the fact is we don't. I mean, even if you just look at writing in the ancient world, for one, the German tribes never wrote anything at all. All of the works that they have were written by Christians after the fact. So we don't really know a ton about what they believed. They didn't write any philosophy. They didn't write any theology. We have their myths recorded by Christians, but not much else. And the sagas and things like that, still also recorded by Christians. Okay. And when we look at the ancient world in the Greco-Roman world, Well, we do have theology, we do have philosophy, we do have all of these ideas out there. But when we look at the oldest fragments of what we have, we might say Homer is one of the older ones. It's probably from around 800. But it's also believed that people like Orpheus lived before that, and a lot of the Orphic ideas are older than that. One of the oldest inscriptions that we have is to Dionysus in Linear B. So gods like him go back, these Orphic gods like Dionysus go back very, very, very far. So I think they make this ridiculous claim that they have this knowledge of what this traditional religion is. They can never fully explain exactly what it means. I suspect it's basically what Fustel de Coulanges says in The Ancient City, which is where I think the majority of these ideas come from, which frankly is a pretty good book. But it's one guy's opinion from the 1800s. I don't think it's the be-all, end-all about these topics. And, we need to have a clearer idea of what traditional religion means as opposed to Platonism. And I think a lot of what he says probably wouldn't even jive with what they actually believed back then, because frankly, we don't know exactly what they believed back then. It's not clear because we don't have anything written down. The best you can do is maybe take a look at some myths or take a look at an epic like the Iliad and the Odyssey and make some inferences based on how they behave, on what those things are. But all of the writings where these things were systematized or talked about or rationalized in any way, shape, or form starts with things like the pre-Socratics and then Plato. So we know a lot about that, but we know very little about their supposed traditional religion and exactly how it works. And I bring this up because it ends up being sort of an attack surface problem where, when we're getting into these arguments with these people, they've got the entire corpus of ancient literature to touch on, right? So they can pull a guy like Phanicles out who wrote about gay people in the ancient world, or what he thought was gay people in the ancient world, and he makes some criticism based off of that. And it's like, this is some rare, obscure author that 99.99% of people are never going to read Phanicles. And so they're not going to have any idea about it, right? And there's no way that I've never read every single classic work, and I probably never will. Like, it'd be a monumental task to read even all of them once. Whereas their supposed traditional religion is this sort of blank check shrouded in mystery that can be whatever they want it to be. And there's no sources to point to really nail it down. So, from an attack surface standpoint, they have all of this material to pull from and point fingers at. And we just kind of have their vibes that we're supposed to argue with. So it's a vastly different problem that we have. But the important thing is, when we're doing these kind of apologetics, is to really turn this thing around. They're going to try to attack the giant corpus of classical literature and pull out specific examples. We do need to find the ones that they are going to use the most and attack back on those and make sure we have solid rebuttals for them. But then we also need to turn this around and attack them, because there's plenty of places to attack their ideology. For one, mythical literalism is absolutely brain dead. And we can get them on the idea that we should treat the myths and the poems as though they are revelations from the gods. I think that that's a really crazy position to take, and we can prove it, because there's all these different myths that have different, even the Germanic myths. The Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda are not the same. They have conflicting stories in them. Well, which one's true? If this is some divine revelation, which one's the reality? We can get into these kind of arguments against them, but I think we need to start pitching and doing more, putting them on the defensive for some of these ideas. But again, I think that starts with our defenses and making sure that we're not getting caught up arguing about stupid things like whether or not Orpheus is gay, or this anti-family idea that they're getting from the Republic. So that's going to be what we're going to talk about in these videos. This is kind of the intro to the rest of them. But looking forward to getting into the details on these.